Fantastic. Well, hello everybody, and huge thanks for bearing with us while we made sure that Darren had some time to get over from Carys speech. And a very warm welcome to this IPPR event supported by the City of London. Our topic today is how can Labour unlock growth in the industries of the future? And we've just heard in Starmer's speech a recommitment to a green industrial strategy and lots of the policies that Labour have set out to do that. So I think it's a fantastic time for us to be discussing this with our brilliant speakers. I think to just kind of introduce the topic, I think this will be familiar to everybody, but I think it's worth reiterating the profound economic crisis that the UK finds itself in. We have stagnant, unequal and unsustainable economic growth, and we haven't bounced back from COVID-19 in the way that we would want to. And in fact, lots of these trends are much longer. So growth and productivity have stalled since the 2008 financial crisis. Now, Labour's growth mission sets an ambition to change this and to secure the highest sustained growth in the G7 with good jobs and productivity growth in every part of the country, making everyone, not just a few, better off. And so I'm hoping that we can get into some of the detail on how industry can support this and how we can unlock the growth that will be needed to meet that mission. So with us today, I have Darren Jones MP, who is Chair of the Business and Trade Committee. Very warm welcome to you, Darren. I have Chris Hayward, who is Policy Chairman of the City of London Corporation, who we're partnering with. Thank you very much. And I have Dr. George Dibb, who is Head of the Centre for Economic Justice at IPPR. Councillor Bev Craig is also going to be joining us in just a moment. She's leader of Manchester City Council and Greater Manchester Combined Authorities Portfolio Lead for Economy, Business and Inclusive Growth. So she'll be joining when she's able. So to kick us off, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to start with some opening remarks. And then we'll have a bit of discussion, and then we'll try and get in as much discussion with the audience as we possibly can. We are running till 4:30, which is slightly different to the listing, so just so that you're aware of that. George, can I start with you?
Yes. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the City of London Corporation for supporting the event. It is fundamentally the question, right? The question that we're here to discuss today is at the heart of Rachel Reeves' speech yesterday, at the heart of Keir's speech today, and has been the thread running through the conference itself, which is how can policy, government, a potential future Labour government, unlock the economic growth which is needed, both to drive better prosperity for households, but also to unlock revenue that will be able to support the public services that we know are struggling at the moment. I'm going to say just a few things, and I will try to be quick, because there's plenty of people here, and it'd be good to get the views from other people in the room. But I think the Labour's approach is kind of has been around this new economic consensus that's emerging on both sides of the Atlantic, which is variously called productivism or modern supply-side economics, or maybe Bidenomics, depending on how optimistic you are about Biden's prospect of remaining president. But essentially, the approach is one of using the tools available to the state to drive more investment, more innovation, and more fundamentally production in the economy. And that's in a way which is less dogmatic about the role of the state. It's not simply about bigger or smaller state. It's about, there might be areas which require less regulation, such as in the planning system, if that is holding back economic prosperity. And there's two things I think we should recognise about the mission. So first of all, there's the headline point, which is to get the UK's economy to be growing the fastest in the G7, which is remarkably challenging, or will be remarkably challenging, but it's probably the right goal. I think there's a second component of it, which is to ensure that prosperity is then equally shared across all households and all parts of the country, which actually might be more challenging still. And I think those two things have to be done together, because the way you get that growth also shapes how it is distributed, of course. So if the economy is the engine of the country, the fuel that it runs on is investment. And I'll just run through a few facts from IPPR's recent research on investment, and I'm afraid it is very depressing because the view from us on the UK's position on investment is very poor. So the last time the UK was average in the G7 on investment in the economy was 1990, and we've got progressively further and further away from that average position since then. We have the lowest business investment in the G7, falling behind Italy and Canada in 2019. And the last time we were average on that business investment was in 2005. So we've seen quite sustained falls in business investment. And if you look at kind of what that would have meant if we had maintained that average position, between 2005, when we were average, and today, we'd have seen an additional £500 billion of additional capital invested in the UK economy. So really these are significant amounts of difference which are going to be holding back our economic growth. And I think we should recognise, I don't think it's been very much talked about, but Rachel's pledge in her speech yesterday that future Labour administration will return those levels of business investment to the level that they were during the last Labour government, which coincidentally is in 2005 when we were at the median level. And I think that is what we should be aiming to do. If we were able to unlock that £500 billion of capital, that's equivalent to building 30 Elizabeth lines or 14 Northern Powerhouse rails. So these are significant differences. It unlocks growth across the country. And then lastly, on the how do we get it so it's shared equitably and broadly, I think we have to take an approach to economic growth and driving growth, which isn't just unlocking the private sector to grow, but also working in partnership. So partnership between government and business, partnership between the public and private sectors. And that means doing a whole range of things. So government being very clear about its offer to business, around open and strategic partnership, giving a very clear direction of travel so businesses understand where the future growth opportunities in the UK economy are. It is fundamentally those future expectations of profit and return which drive investment decision making, not things like marginal effects of corporation tax. The critical role of the government in providing stability and consistency. I've heard that at pretty much every business event that I've been to over the past few days. And that means both in policy, but also in the macroeconomic context. Cite Liz Truss. Third, the role of industrial strategy in giving a clear steer to the economy. Using regulations and tax tweaking those so that they favour productive investment and productivity enhancement. And the role of catalytic public sector investment, something that we've been advocating for a long time. So putting public investment into institutions which crowd in rather than crowd out private sector investment. There's a real new consensus on that. Everyone from Mariana Mazzucato to the CBI agree that public investment doesn't crowd out the private sector. It can crowd it in if it's well designed. And I think getting that right will be one of the major challenges. But if we do, then the UK can return to growth and it can be shared equitably across different households and across all parts of the country.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, George, for that scene setting. Darren, I'd like to turn to you next to say a little bit about Labour's plan for unlocking this growth.
Thank you. Carys, great to be with you all this afternoon. My job has got slightly harder than was trailed now that I'm not chair of the business committee, but deputy to Rachel Reeves, I've got to answer the questions, not just ask them, which is slightly more difficult, but I'm very much looking forward to the task. Look, you've heard from Keir in his speech today a lot of focus on missions, which he's been talking about for some time. But I really feel at this conference that everybody, irrespective of whether you're a kind of business or a member or a trade union or a politician, it's kind of clicked as to why that's actually really, really important. And it's important for two reasons. One, the missions are very bold. They are ambitious for the country. So every time a journalist says to me, on the TV, well, if you're not going to spend loads of money, what's the point? I'm like, hello, I mean, look at these ambitions. These are difficult ambitions to achieve, and that symbolises the level of ambition that we have for the country. The second thing that's really important about them is the way in which that changes the kind of machinery and working of government. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. One of the failures of the Conservatives' industrial strategy was that officials in the business department tried to implement it. they had too many things, really, and not enough budget behind the things that were too many, which is part of the problem. No one else really across Whitehall cared about the industrial strategy, including in the Treasury, who have since cancelled it and taken it back in as a Treasury priority. And it just wasn't delivered. Now, the reason the missions are important in that context is that the first mission is a mission in and of itself, but it's also central to the other missions. And that means that whether you're in the health department, the education department, the home office, the business department, the energy department, the Treasury team, everybody is accountable for delivering against those missions. And one of the things that Keir did really sensibly was that the owner of the KPI on economic growth is essentially me and Rachel in the Treasury. And that's really interesting because one of the criticisms in the past is the Treasury is the place around controlling spend and business case processes, enforcing fiscal rules, all of that type of stuff. But it's been criticised for never really being active in economic development, something the business department does, even though the Treasury didn't really give the business department the powers and the budget to do that. And that was a long-running frustration for many businesses. By giving the Treasury the KPI on economic growth, it forces everybody in the Treasury team to be thinking about economic development as well as the enforcement of fiscal rules and Treasury processes. And it might sound a little bit nuanced, but I think that's actually really kind of critical to think about how a Labour government would work differently. And you'll see more as we get nearer to the election, if you're into machinery of government kind of chats about how some of the wiring will be changed to reflect mission-led oriented government and how we think that will help us deliver on those priorities. So my job as Deputy Chancellor is two things. One, it's about enforcing the fiscal rules, as any good Chief Secretary of the Treasury would do, but it's also about working with colleagues on that transformative change and saying, how do we work together? How do you provide that strategic, coherent support across all of the spending departments to make sure that we're all pulling in the right direction? Because ultimately, it's going to be me and Rachel, we hope around the cabinet table, having to explain the outcomes on economic growth under a Labour government. So I think that's going to be really crucial and important for delivering on these bold ambitions.
Fantastic. And apologies, Darren, for preparing our briefings too far ahead. Fantastic. I'll turn it over to Chris now.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Can I start by saying how pleased City of London is to be partnering with IPPR on this panel this afternoon. So look, the City of London, so that's where the financial services, financial professional services primarily stem from, and I'm the political leader of the City of London Corporation, and I must be the only political leader in the United Kingdom who hasn't got a political administration to lead, because I've got 125 politicians, all of whom are independents. But we have a USP in the corporation, and that is that we convene financial and professional services, and we try and get them to speak with one voice, both to governments, to politicians of all parties, because we're non-party political, and internationally as well. And undoubtedly, the biggest challenge that any government will face, whoever is elected in a year's time, is how we get economic growth against a background of stagnation in the UK economy for so many years. And in the financial services sector, which is a sector which in its own way has to finance its own future growth, as well as financing the growth in the economy, what Rachel picked up yesterday, what I picked up in Rachel's speech, was her recognition that public finance alone can't answer this question. There needs to be a partnership between public and private sector. And we heard the Shadow Chancellor tell us that yesterday. I think she's right. And I also think what is encouraging in the Labour Party of today is that they do seem to want to be business friendly. They do seem to want to work in partnership with the private sector. And I think the answers for the future are around that. Now, as I travel around the world lobbying and talking about the UK financial and professional services sector, one thing I see is that in our competitor countries, and particularly the Asian countries, their financial services sectors have clear strategic plans, clear visions, clear programs for the future. And I don't think we really have that in the United Kingdom. So I commissioned some work together with 300 representatives of the sector to develop a strategy, vision for economic growth, a pathway to prosperity. And we've costed that if the measures which are in that report, and we're happy to share that report with you, if they're implemented by politicians, they could drive £225 billion worth of investment growth into the UK economy between now and 2030. And why do I say 2030? Because I think we need a plan that stretches beyond one parliament. You're not going to solve this challenge in one parliament alone. And what business tells us is the constant changes of policy when political parties change in government is a major, major challenge. So we produced a plan which, and Darren will be pleased to know, this requires no new primary legislation, it requires no shake-up of Whitehall departments, and it comes at a minimal cost. But it is about unlocking the opportunities that we've got. So, for example, in the insurance sector, government has already said this, Solvency II, we think is a good reform because it will potentially allow money into infrastructure projects. We think the Mansion House Compact, the reforms around DC pensions, allowing potentially 5% of DC pensions to be invested in high-growth British businesses is really, really important. And also, we should not forget green finance and the opportunities that the transition financing and scaling up transition financing will provide for our country as well. And on that subject, we need consistency and clarity from politicians and from governments around net zero, because it's absolutely right, and I understand that governments have to consider the cost to the consumer, but they also have to consider the cost of business, who are working to a series of targets and are investing. And if you want investment, the one thing you have to generate is confidence. Confidence and stability around your government. And that's what, if Labour are elected, we in the city will be looking for. The financial services sector, incidentally, employs 2.5 million people. 2/3 of those jobs are outside of London. And they contribute, the financial services sector, a total of 100 billion of taxes into the Treasury every year. But I don't want it to be a sector that takes. I don't want it to be a sector that's all about rich bankers. I want it to be a sector that supports the growth across the United Kingdom of new jobs, new industries, and new businesses. So that's what I'd say by way of introduction, and I'm sure we'll get into some more of the detail of this in due course.
Hello, and sorry I'm late, everyone. So I'm Councillor Bev Craig, and unfortunately I'm that person that's losing my voice at this point of conference. So I really wanted just to talk about two areas. I think the first is some lessons from Manchester in many ways around how we can ensure economic growth that goes across the country. And then the second is an area around, I suppose, the exam question around future industries. So for those not familiar with Manchester, we're a city of 600,000 people. We've grown in size by almost 200,000 people over the last 20 years. And obviously we're part of a city region of just under 3 million people. The story of Manchester is well rehearsed. It was a city that was struggling, not at ease with itself in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, wondering in a post-industrialised world what the future of our economy looked like. So the first thing I'd say has been around an economic strategy of an intentionality in growing the depth of a variety of sectors. So taking all the lessons from the past, that a place that builds itself just around one new and emerging industry means that it's at the risk of shocks down the line. So we took a focus at that point on growing financial and professional services, life sciences, advanced materials and manufacturing, and digital, creative and tech. And if we think about some of the areas of strength now that we have as a city and a city region, it's precisely the ability to help build and grow an ecosystem that's led to some of our successes. So if you treated in isolation tech separately to the financial and professional services, we wouldn't have the largest fintech economy outside of London, worth over £5 billion GVA to our economy each year. And I think if we think about how we've achieved that, there's a lot of talk around the relationship with business. In Manchester, we only are where we are because we recognise that if we want to deal with the question of economic growth, we can only do that hand in hand and alongside business. And you can create a culture that embeds that in local places. But I would also reflect that the challenge that we have when we talk about economic growth across the country is who will it be for and where will it happen? And I think there's something from the very off when we think about the opportunity, particularly of cities, to be able to lead the charge on some of that economic growth whilst developing a plan for the whole country. And we've just done a piece of work through core cities, the 11 largest cities outside of London, and looking at private sector investment that is already there. If we got the conditions right, if we got the levers from government right, if we created coherent local economic strategies equally across each of our cities, over £100 billion a year is sat ready to go, invested in those cities. So the prize is great. And I think when we think about one of the things we've been grappling with in Manchester is the UK's National Productivity Challenge and how that plays out in cities like ours. So we all know that productivity has been declining and not picking up the pace it needs to in this country for decades. If we look at places like Manchester, the story is relatively positive. Our growth has been one of the highest outside of London. And I would say, though, we've still got a 30% gap in productivity between our economy in Manchester and what we see in the capital. So I think there will be specific places that will need additional tools if we're to think about how we talk about prosperity in something that reflects the geography of our citizens. And I think the final thing that I'd wrap up just on that is around some of the levers that we need and some of the ingredients that have to be in place. Certainty and stability is certainly something, and it would be remiss of me to recount what sounds like a sketch from a political satire about a government that turned up in a city to stand in a disused railway station to scrap rail infrastructure for the future. But the point and the frustration that's come from that, and the reason why we fronted that with businesses, is the point around certainty. So we've seen over £2 billion investment in a pocket just beside the train station, on a basis that actually the conversation that we're having with King's Cross and businesses there is that we need to be closer. We're talking to Cambridge and looking at what we can do around our life sciences. So connectivity is key. And it doesn't matter which infrastructure project we're talking about here. The ability to give stable, long-term planning around infrastructure is fundamental. And that speaks just as much east-west as it does north-south. And then the final thing I'll say is in this area of thinking about industries and being careful that we get the right balance between a nationally led policy that talks about the totality of investment, such as in R&D, and the ability for local places to pick up their own economic strategy and run with it. Because the absence of connecting the two together is where we saw some of the challenges with the briefly lived industrial strategy. To have a big piece of work up here, and then for places to decide some of their own futures, but without any connection between the two, means that, frankly, we'll waste quite a lot of time and energy and business will in bringing forward a coherent plan. And the final point, and is probably where I begin, in that we need to be careful. In a world where we want to talk about specialising and places that do things well, that actually we need to understand what it is that we're trying to grow when we talk about our economy. The word ecosystem is often overused by politicians, often without not knowing what it means. But the reality of having other industries that you're able to draw on has been so fundamentally important. And then the question around who growth is for. And I think we need to talk about prosperity in a way that talks about both economic and social prosperity. And I think that's the way through when we talk about how growth can benefit the whole country.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bev. And I actually think that's a really interesting point for us to jump into our discussion. That point about kind of specialisation, but also identifying comparative advantage. George, I might come to you first on this because we're doing some work on it. I'm interested in how a Labour government should be thinking about identifying comparative advantage for the UK.
Yeah, it is a really great question, and I think the challenge with the question of specialisation is that it can be very constraining on the debate around economic policy because people can view comparative advantage. So comparative advantage is a way that economists talk about what is a place or a country good at. What do they manufacture better or cheaper or more productively than anyone else? And people say, oh, the UK has a comparative advantage in financial services, or the UK has a comparative advantage in creative industries. And it does, that's true. But that is the consequence of decisions which have been made, the aggregate decisions that have been made over decades, that has made us good at those things, and the decisions not taken which have made us not good at other things. So comparative advantage is itself dynamic, and you can change that over time. You can decide to be good at things, and that might involve waste, which is like often the thing that politicians fear most. But waste for the sake of kind of driving this path dependency, which means that you get good at doing things in the future, can also be really important. So I think it's about this kind of question of strategic decision making, and it goes to the heart of the things that Darren and Rachel and all the Shadow Treasury team have been talking about in terms of the industrial strategy that they're proposing. But when that decision making is done well, and when you look at when it's done well in places, decisions can be made that really build on the specialisation that exists in places. And that my favourite example of this is the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, which some people might know about. It's the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre. It's just outside Sheffield, Rotherham, a place that I'm really familiar with. And it's a spin-out or a part of the university, and it builds on the university's strength in academic knowledge. It builds on a latent skills base that existed in that place because of the history of that place and the companies that used to be based in that place. So there were people there with skills that existed, and there were companies already out there in a supply chain that could be that was foundation that it could be built on. And the Advanced Manufacturing Catapult has really grown and gone from strength to strength. But what it has led to is that Boeing have made a really significant hundreds of millions of pounds investment to build a new facility in Rotherham, where they're able to make wing spurs cheaper and more productively than they could in Mexico. So components are made in Sheffield now and flown across to Seattle, where they're put into planes. And that is the consequence of those strategic decisions. So I think, yes, we have to look at what exists, what specializations are out there, but also sometimes you've got to take a punt and just decide you really want to be good at something.
Thanks, George. Darren, how would Labour approach this question of the need for a national strategy, but also giving local areas space and to set their own economic strategy?
Yeah, so I'm not expecting my job when I sign off business case requests in a Treasury context to involve me deciding what we're going to be good at. And let me just flesh that out a little. When we talk about partnerships, not just with business, universities are a prime example. When Keir, as he did in his speech today, talked a lot about devolution of decision-making, of place-based decision-making. All of those different things mean that it's actually you guys that know what you think you're good at and what risk you're willing to take to find out whether you're good at it. It's really not for me or officials in a kind of Westminster context to decide for you. And so the real question for us is how do we unblock restrictions that prevent that from happening, which will be, for example, in Peter Carr's speech, we've committed to 10-year funding cycles for research and development to give stability of income so that these types of decisions can be taken. We have agreed with at-risk budgets for the Advanced Research and Invention Agency to allow some more risk-taking to be done. We've talked about co-investing with business in strategic assets or strategic national infrastructure, which we hope will open up the opportunities for places, universities, spin-outs, businesses to decide to invest in those areas to make access and use of those bits of infrastructure. And then let's see what we're good at. I mean, part of the problem, I think, at the moment is that for lots of people, they don't feel like they're able to take the risk to find out if they're good at something because they can't access the lab space, the high-speed broadband, the skills, the capital to be able to grow and to scale. And one of my reflections on what's been so good about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which we are not going to be able to replicate in the UK, and so we've got to think about how we translate it to the UK context. In America, they're just giving money to everyone. Right? They're not saying this sector is a priority and this sector is a priority. It's basically like everything. Like, if you want it, take it. And they're uncapped budgets, which we're not going to have in this country. And it's a long-term commitment. So if a business is saying, I want to make a decision to invest in this lab or this factory or this manufacturing facility, and they say, it's probably going to take me 15 years to kind of pay off the capex cost of the investment in this. The great thing about the Inflation Reduction Act is I know that for up to 20 years I can claim tax credits back on the modelling. It gets the final investment decision across the line much more easily and then opens that up. And another great thing about the American scheme is some of the social policy conditionality that's attached to it. So yeah, you can get some tax credits if you're doing one of these great things. We'll give you a bit more if you invest in this particular area or these types of areas. And we're going to give you even more if you put a childcare facility in your chip manufacturing plant. Now, the risk that we have to grapple with in the UK context when we're talking about our national wealth fund, our investment alongside business, is in an environment where budgets will be capped, where they do need to go through business case processes, where there's a little bit more of a distinction between OPEX and CAPEX costs. How do we ensure that the schemes are accessible enough so that they're competitive with other jurisdictions, that businesses will actually access them, and it's not just going to be a kind of rubbish voucher scheme that no one uses, and that you get to the position where it really helps get those deals done, including on delivering social policy without engineering it to death. Because one of the problems we have sometimes in Whitehall is we engineer these things to death and then no one can be bothered to use them. The budget gets unspent and the Treasury claws it back for something else because something's on fire or falling down or something. And so we're really committed, as you've heard right at the very top of the political debate from Keir, from Rachel, through Johnny and Ed and Peace and all the others, to unlock a lot of this flow of investment, of activity, of entrepreneurialism, because we need it in every part of the country. It's our job in the Treasury team, and we will set out more detail of this in advance of the next election, but how do you the scheme design the rules around these programs so that we try to get some of the great benefits that we've seen really leveraged in the American context with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Fantastic. Chris, perhaps you could expand a bit on what the finance industry would actually need from Labour policy to kind of know where it should be investing and how, etc.
I think the first point I would make, and I will come on to that point, but is that I don't think when you're looking at the jobs of the future and the industries of the future, that the UK is a one-size-fits-all economy. You know, different parts of the country do have different opportunities and they have different challenges. So there's a couple of things, though, that I think are common across the country. First is around skills. We need the very, very best, not just domestic, but international skills attracted to this country we can possibly get to drive the industries of the future. The second thing is we need to be a digital-led economy. There is no question in my mind that things like AI are not going to go away. They have the capacity to transform the way we work. And so we're coming back to your point about the financial services sector. When I look at fintech, for example, you know, we are one of the most successful countries, you know, in Europe and frankly just outside of the US in fintech. But we're really good at startups, really poor at scale-ups. So what happens is we groom these businesses, and because of lack of capital flows, they go and they don't list on the London Stock Exchange, they go and list on the NASDAQ, you know, market. Now, we don't want that, and that's why I think we have to invest in these businesses of the future. These are the businesses that will create the jobs, and these are the businesses we need to keep in the UK. What we don't want to do is start developing growth, developing businesses, only to lose it to another part of the world. So I would say support on the fintech front is the answer to your question, because I think it's you know, that's my narrow financial services specialism, but I do think we need to do it. Thank you, sir. Nobody, but he could do after that.
Bev, I'm interested in your reflections of what you've heard, but also, you know, what Manchester, and actually what Greater Manchester would need to be true of Labour's policy in Westminster to unlock growth.
So I think we are in a situation at the moment where international competitiveness is challenging. You know, now if I think about when myself and Andy Brennan went out and did a trade visit to the US in the spring, and we've got Japan in December, we're often competing against places where their governments are seeking to incentivise the relocation of strategic businesses into economies. And I think there is a bit of a lesson in sometimes that the places that are most successful are places that had to incentivise. If I think about Manchester, Greater Manchester in the Northwest, growing specialism in cyber, much of that has come through an intentional plan from the City Council and the Combined Authority to lower GCHQ and a little bit of an ecosystem beside them. But that's involved us refitting the building. It's involved us paying some of the costs, and it's involved us competing against others to make sure that we're able to get that business embedded. We're now seeing that industry grow significantly. So I think there are some lessons in the role that for strategic locations, incentivisation isn't something that we've quite got here. I wasn't a fan of the tax incentivisation stuff around innovation zones, actually, and some of that's a lesson from what we see in the US. You know, if you compare Texas, for example, to Silicon Valley and some of the relocation of businesses out of there, they might be there for tax purposes, but nobody's actually going to work in Austin in their offices. They're still based over in California. So I think we have to be a little bit careful around some of the consequences of what we ask for. I think in a broader context, if I think about GM, the ability to have a coherent plan that speaks to a sensible economic geography with a track record of delivering is the thing that's consistently the most attractive to local, regional and international investors. And I think that's something in GM we do very well. I know in the City of Manchester that we need a thriving city centre that needs to be bigger if we're to drive up prosperity and productivity across the city region and across the northwest. But I also know from a population perspective, I also need a thriving Bury, Oldham, Rochdale, Middleton, because that's where my residents in North Manchester are closer to. So I think places that can tell sensible economic stories as to why they work together already start to win the case in being more attractive to business. And off of government, obviously we've been successful with some of our trailblazer negotiations. We're talking to the Labour Party about some of the things that we didn't get, that we asked for. And I think there is a real opportunity in deeper, more coherent devolution across the country to be able to put some of those things in place. And then the final thing I'd say is skills. So we talk a lot about skills, and sometimes we end up using skills as the panacea for all other problems that are often structural within our local economies. Skills are important, so the retention and attraction of some of the brightest and the best from across the world is important. Keeping our graduates in place is important, so we work really hard over the last decade, so we're now at 55% of retention for the University of Manchester and MMU, and that's part of our population growth. But if we expect people at the age of 16 to arrive fully formed, ready to make a choice around technical or academic, without recognising that in some of our poorest areas, their lives are already decided in the first 1,000 days, or the first 4 years, their paths are already set. That's where the connection of the social policy comes in. You know, there was a reason that things like Sure Start got us on a path to better economic growth because you're investing in people earlier. So I think it's just making sure the two are connected.
Fantastic. I'd like to open up to the audience now, and I think we do have a roving mic with Emma. And I'll take a few questions at a time. I'm going to start with the lady there.
Thank you. Hi, I represent Primera, so they work with business improvement districts, and particularly in London. However, there are many all across the country. I feel like, well, not just me, but business improvement districts are really good for growth, especially in post-COVID climate, in a way of convening communities. Do you think that they can be used more and be exercised more to find more growth, particularly with like daytime economy to get people back into the offices, as well as nighttime economy in the more office areas?
Fantastic, thank you. Won't make you run around, we'll go straight there.
Hi, Martin Turner from Manchester Economic Forecasting. I'm really encouraged to hear the City of London wants to be part of the green reindustrialisation. If you look at the raw stats, only 18% of UK commercial banks' balance sheet on the asset side lending is to business investment. Tell me why I'm not right to be cynical looking forward.
And then one at the front here.
Hi there, my name's Steph Coulter and I'm from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at University of Cambridge. And I was wondering what, if any, role that fiscal devolution could play in...
Sorry, say that again.
What, if any, role would fiscal devolution play in driving economic growth in the future?
Fantastic. In fact, I'll take one more and over here. Thank you.
I'd like to make a fairly radical suggestion, particularly to the Member of Parliament, that I think we should do the opposite now of what we've done for the last 20 years. In fact, we should reinstate British industry. I've never been in favour of nationalisation, but I am now. I'm in favour of the state taking stakes in major industries, the same way that China did 20 years ago, and the same way that China became the workshop of the world with export rebates and policies that were designed to create a rust belt in America and destroyed a lot of industry in the UK. I think it was known as dumping 20 years ago. I know that the Labour Party had all kinds of problems trying to stop that. I don't believe in a protectionist world, but I think there's an opportunity to actually put money directly into industry. Let's have a steel industry back, under which we control. And going forward, that's absolutely necessary, isn't it? That we can protect our own borders, that we can protect our own industries. We're not vulnerable to all the bad things that are happening in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fantastic. So we have 4 questions there. I won't ask everyone to answer all of them, but I'll try and make sure we cover the set. Bev, I wonder if you want to start with the business improvement districts.
Yes, so I think they've certainly got a role in Manchester. We've got a very active one, and I think what the role can be is around those particularly practical day-to-day issues, incentivising people to be more kind of present and involved in decision-making. But I don't think it's enough in terms of business engagement. So if I think about the depth of what we've got in Manchester and across Greater Manchester, we kept the LEP and transitioned it into a GM business board because it works. I've got a city business sounding board that will take through kind of key policies. We've got a citywide forum that brings together all of the public sector, major private players from each industry, and also community groups. I think there has to be real depth to what engagement looks like. And I think I will leave particularly some of the questions around fiscal devolution for Darren, but I would just throw in probably 2 things. The first is that in Greater Manchester, what's been really, really successful in incentivising further growth has been the retention of business rates. So whilst not in the space of fiscal devolution as the debate that we're having at the moment, actually incentivising areas to put investment to see return that they can then re-put into other areas is vitally important. I would also say, and I would say this as Manchester, we've just gone ahead and done our accommodation business improvement district, which is the closest that the UK can get to tourist tax. So we charge £1 per room per night. And the point of that is meant to be in the spirit of additionality of service, to both make Manchester an even better place to live, but also to think about some of the things that there is an impact for local communities. And I think in the spirit of additionality rather than core funding, tourist tax is something that's interesting. But the reason that we talk about tourist tax in the context of fiscal devolution is because it's the easy one. And I think when we have that deeper conversation around the retention of some of the harder stuff, actually gets more complicated. Because even council tax, for every 1% I rise my bills in Manchester, I get £1 million. Surrey gets 7. And I think we just have to be careful that we don't end up in a system that through fiscal devolution accidentally reinstates some of the problems of old.
Do you want to pick that up, Darren, and perhaps also the point about state ownership of stakes in business?
Yeah, well, I mean, Bev's final point is the key point, really. You're not going to see any bold fiscal devolution measures from us at this stage, because we do need to be very careful in the way they're designed and delivered. But you are hearing a commitment over the long term to devolution. And so who knows what the future looks like in that context. But the direction of travel around decision-making, place-based decision-making, how budgets that have been signed off being spent, could be part. That's probably going to be an ongoing part of the political debate. But you're not going to see a commitment to fiscal devolution at this election. On nationalisation, other than the train operating companies, when their contracts come to an end and the state will compete for renewal, we're not nationalising any other industries. But the National Wealth Fund, which Keir talked about in his speech today, one of the main instruments that we expect to use through that fund is equity stakes. So in new investments or kind of decarbonisation investments that are very, very expensive, instead of just offering the normal instruments you might get from a kind of government package around contingent liabilities or underwriting or direct grants, we're going to be pulling together, we hope, a portfolio of equity stakes in strategic assets across the country, so that, as Keir said today, the British people get to benefit from that. We're not just subsidising a business that can then take the profits offshore. Thank you very much. And so there will be new opportunities of public ownership and shares of public ownership in key industries. And then, of course, GB Energy will be entirely publicly owned as a kind of state-owned entity. So you've kind of got rail, you've got GB Energy, you've got the National Wealth Fund, and a kind of expected rate of return on public sector investment alongside private sector investment more generally, which I think is actually pretty progressive and pretty bold. But we're not going to be saying, hey, we're just going to nationalise this industry at the next election.
You can keep control of other policies as well, employment policies, the bigger stake you have.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Chris?
Okay, I'll just take a quick nibble at each of them, or not all of them. I think I'll keep off the contentious nationalisation proposals and leave that to the national politician. Look, let me just touch first of all on bids, because we have a lot of bids in London. You touched on that. Got a lot of them driven by Premier, and they've been transformational in the City of London in terms of stimulating business to be engaged and involved and investing. So, I'm a huge fan of bids. Let me be absolutely clear on that. Let me turn to the gentleman who said to tell him why he shouldn't be cynical of the City of London committing to investing in green growth. I think was the point you were basically making. Look, I think, first of all, for business to invest, the private sector to invest, and just go back to GFANS and the commitments that were made at GFANS at COP, you first of all need political stability, right? There hasn't been a hell of a lot of political stability around in recent years. There has to be, I think, clarity, absolute clarity. There's a £100 million gap in terms of transition financing at the moment for green finance. We need banks to fill it. Of course we need banks to fill it. So I think you're right to express an element of cynicism because it hasn't happened thus far. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to drive it and focus on it and try and make it happen. And I think we can make it happen. Devolution. Well, there's financial devolution and there's devolution. They're two slightly different things. In general terms on devolution, I take a view that devolution is good. I am not of the mind that Westminster always knows best, apart from when Darren's expressing it, then obviously it's a different. I do think, therefore, the regions and the big cities have a big role to play in stimulating the economic growth in their regions. It shouldn't all be left to Westminster to do. So I think there's a principle at stake there. So those would be my comments on those three comments. I'm not going to be drawn on nationalisation.
Do you want to be more contentious, George?
Yeah, I can kind of sweep up some of those points, I guess. I mean, on the fiscal devolution side, it kind of goes back to what Darren was saying about who actually makes the decision. I mean, in my example of the high-value manufacturing catapult, not to over-labour the point, but that has been very successful, and success has many parents, so lots of people have claimed that it was their idea to do that. But the RDA, the Yorkshire and Humberside RDA, claimed that they were the first people to actually to instigate and set up the Catapult Centre and to make the decision about where it would be and what it would focus on. So I absolutely agree that places often know better than Whitehall what they are good at and what latent skills and supply chains they have in those places. And clearly, if you want to set up a research institute that costs tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds, you need some money to do that. And therefore you can enable decision making, but that decision making can be more powerful if there is fiscal devolution there as well. We could probably hold a whole panel on just the nationalisation of industries question. I think there's an interesting question about the resilience point, the global question, given that we are going into probably an era of unprecedented global instability. A single drought in Taiwan is basically responsible for a significant part of inflation in the UK in used vehicles because the drought shut down a semiconductor fab, which slowed down car production, which then pushed up the price of used vehicles. The question is nationalisation the right tool to build your resilience? And I think there are probably some areas of the economy where that might be the case, but there are others where actually more competitive sectors more competitive approach might matter. The way I think about it, though, is that the fundamental is what I said at the beginning, which is that productivism is around being less dogmatic about what the state should do and doing it smarter. There are parts of the economy which are essentially natural monopolies, and therefore I think it's pretty normal to argue that the state should own those, because otherwise you have value extraction. But you could also try and break those up by opening up to competition, which is similar to what Rachel announced yesterday in terms of opening grid connections to competitive tender. So I think that it's really hard. On the case of the National Wealth Fund, as Darren said, that will own stakes, or if instituted, would own stakes in businesses. We have drawn a proposal of a national investment fund, which we think fits within the brief of the wealth fund that Labour is proposing. We haven't proposed that takes majority stakes in firms. We think it should be mandated to take minority stakes, and that's because the core mandate of that organisation should be the crowding in of private sector finance into the green industries and lowering the cost of capital by putting the public pound into those investment decisions. But beyond those, where I think there is private investment waiting to go into some of those sectors, there might be bits of the green transition which we just need to hack and do through the state, fundamentally.
Fantastic. I do want to make sure we get...
Nationalisation, by the way, only strategic investment in key industries.
Fantastic. So I want to take another round of questions. I've got the woman wearing the white top in the middle, Emma.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Kate Morrison from Vodafone. We were really pleased to see the link about the importance of investment in infrastructure and the nod that Rachel gave to 5G yesterday in her speech. I was wondering what role you see greater digitalisation playing in a growth strategy or growth across the whole of the UK.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think there was one just here. Emma, just in the blue suit here.
Thank you. Alec Lever, Richmond Park, CLP Labour Business. I'd kind of take issue, George, with your premise that investment is the way to lead, because businesses really won't invest unless there is a certainty of demand for their output. It's a chicken and egg situation. Well, it's a horse and cart situation. Now, we have to ask ourselves why, in an economy that is 70% dependent on the earning and spending of wages, that we've had a stagnation in real wages for the last 15 years. Now, obviously, not obvious, but there may well be a systemic reason for that goes beyond productivity and all the excuses. It's basically that the boards of companies are being held hostage to deliver ever-increasing dividends rather than seeing wages as an investment in demand growth. And therefore, they're unable to focus on growing the top line, which is where productivity benefits come from, rather than the short-term bottom line. I won't go on, but...
So is it a do you agree question or...
I challenge you, Carys,
so turn it into a question.
to tell Darren but how much more revenue HMRC would get for each 1% increase in the wage share of GDP. I'll tell you, 4% will give him 32 billion to spend.
Fantastic. I'll take some more questions. There's one here.
Thank you. I'm a pharmacist, Ian Strachan. I own pharmacies between Liverpool in the west over to Bury and Saddleworth in the east. And people much wiser than me talk about growth, and they always talk about growth, the important thing being it's sustainable and it being equitable, as you said earlier. And I guess my question's pitched at Darren, I think, because have you ever considered community pharmacy, or has Labour considered it? Is it on Labour's radar as a tool for investment to save? We're a sector that is incredibly productive. we're accessible, we're convenient, we're resilient. We showed that through the pandemic. We can improve patient outcomes and well-being. And it's really a question for the fact that we're a sector that's in tremendous dire straits at the moment, yet it's a sector that can deliver, and it consistently proves it can deliver because of those credentials. So that's my question, really. It's about an investment strategy to save in community pharmacy.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll take the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Ben Reynolds, Sustain the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. It's a question for Darren. Welcome to your reflections on rewiring the government to achieve Labour's missions. And you mentioned Treasury having the KPI on economic growth. I was just wondering how you'd ensure this isn't at the expense of other missions, such as increasing the cost of the NHS or exacerbating environmental problems, but rather that it would prioritise green business growth.
Great. And we've probably got time for one more if we don't make it closing, so I'll go over here. Sorry, lots of
I'll make it as quick as I can. It follows on, my name's Jackie O'Reilly from the University of Sussex Digital Futures at Work Research Centre, and it follows on from the question the member at the front asked about what are the causes of low investment, because you've had a period of 13 years with near to zero interest rates. If you're not going to invest then, when? So the question to people on the doorsteps will want to know is, why will your policies work when in the previous 13 years there was more fertile ground potentially for investment that didn't happen? Now, one of the explanations on the panel was insecurity. But lots of other members of the G7 have had insecurity since 2010. Maybe we've just exacerbated with a bit of Brexit pajazz, but that's not the only explanation. So the really big question is, if these investment strategies are going to work, in order for them to work, we need to understand why they haven't worked in the past 13 years. So what's the explanation? Is it maybe insecurity is one, but it's not enough? Is it paying dividends to shareholders? What are the other reasons? Or is it part of the British model of short-time strategies? So I think that's really important to answer, to be able to say what will work this time.
Great. There's quite a bit for Darren there, so I might let you gather your thoughts while I come to the others. Chris, perhaps you could pick up that last question. What's the cause of low investment?
I think actually nearly all those questions were directed at you, Darren. I think they're all... I'm not going to explain the Labour Party's policies to you because I don't know them in any detail. I'm actually going to flick it a bit back to the one question I think I can answer on, because it's a point I made earlier. You asked the question about digital and the role it should play in driving growth. My answer would be in one word: fundamental. Right? Digital. The world is now about data and digital, and if we don't realise that and we don't wake up and do that, our economy will not grow. So the answer to yours is it's a fundamental point. I do think the other points are really Darren's baby, but they could be theirs as well. So.
Oh no, the joy of being a council leader is you get to say what you like and you're not strict. On a really serious point, so two things. I think share the points around the growth of how we digitise our economy going forward. I think there's two challenges in that. The first is thinking about access for people, and both in skills and also the role that business has to play in having some of that skills conversation. We know in Manchester, despite the great growth that we've had in some of our sectors, that we managed to get really good entry-level skill sets in there, but what happens 5 years down the line? So I think there's a real conversation around what the future of industry looks like to get ahead for the skills question that's helpful. And then I suppose just briefly on the investment point, I think it's fair to say that there are little examples of where things haven't been in decline over the last 13 years. That's why I use Manchester as an example, is that statistically we're in a different place. And we've managed to secure that investment and start to book the trend because we had a long-term plan. Because we had a coherent economic narrative that's existed for 15 years. Political certainty meant that even with the change of leader, my predecessor did this job for 25 years, they knew that me coming in wasn't going to rip that up, but actually you'd be able to continue in the same direction. People say it's more akin to German stability politically, so I don't think we can underestimate that stability point, which is why I make it.
Great. George, I wonder if you could pick up the stagnant wages point. I guess the point there is that it's not just about investment in growth, but also the distribution of the returns to growth.
Yeah, and I think, I didn't catch your name, but your question and Jackie's question are kind of coming at a very similar point, right? That is, what is the explanation for our poor investment, and is it simply around that we can just put more public investment in and that will do the same thing? I think that, so on the very first question, which was, you took issue with the idea that you can just achieve this through public investment crowding in private. I think that's absolutely right. You can't. There may be some sectors where you can, but you have to couple it with creating demand, fundamentally. And you could do that through the power of the state too. We did that during the pandemic. The reason AstraZeneca invested in the UK and in the COVID vaccine here was that the government said, if you make it, we'll buy it. And a purchase guarantee is a really strong signal for a business because they have certainty that someone will buy the product. And it's very similar to the question around then demand on a macro level. If I knew the answer, why have we had poor productivity growth in the UK, I would be in Sweden receiving the Nobel Prize rather than on a panel in Liverpool. But I think there are various explanations. Fundamentally, it goes to the firm decision making. Is it that the people in the company are making bad decisions? Is it because they haven't been trained enough? There's this kind of management training argument. Is it that the wrong people are in the room making the decision? That we need workers on boards, or we need to expand or change corporate governance? Is it that they don't have enough money? At IPPR, we think that it's probably a mix, but I would lean personally towards the demand stagnation argument, which is that over the last 15 years, we have chosen to pull demand out of the economy through austerity, which means that those companies, even if they have the money to invest in improving their costs and in improving their productivity, choose not to because they don't know that there's a secure market at the other end. And that's because government economic policy at the macro level has pulled money out of people's pockets, and that means they don't have it to spend in companies. And I think that, therefore, to really nail the modern supply side, you also have to look at the demand side too, and that it's very hard to do one without the other. I'm not going to take the bait on the HMT, machinery of government question. I could talk about that a long time, but I think that having a proper economic strategy that lives within an institution is actually put into practice is the key, because at the moment the Treasury just doesn't do that. And the point on digital, the only thing I'd say is to loop it into that kind of productivity and investment piece. We know that we need to improve productivity, and that means investment in firms. If you compare, the only good thing about the UK's productivity and how bad it is that we have a great potential for catch-up with other countries. And that's the only positive I can possibly take from it. Other countries have done that in the past. Japan and Italy did it in the post-war era. They caught up with other advanced economies. But they did that by investing in tractors and factories. That's not the case in the UK today in the 21st century. The way we're going to catch up productivity-wise is by investing in digital technologies in firms, largely probably in the service sector as well as in manufacturing.
Fantastic. Darren.
Well, I think George answered everything, so we can just go now, I think. I'll take them in a bit of a random order. I mean, we own the KPI in the Shadow Treasury team on economic growth, but Keir's been very clear with everybody that doesn't just mean it's the Treasury that delivers economic growth. It's kind of like, everyone else has to be involved. And there's some kind of subcommittee structures that I'm partly involved in delivering about coordinating that accountability across counterparts, across different departments in opposition, and we will do the same in government. The other missions as well, though, I mean, it's also part of our job in the Treasury team because of the business case sign-off process. So, Wes and his team are not going to be able to transform the National Health Service unless we're signing off how he wants to spend the budget, capital investment, kind of the policies he wants to implement. And the policy sign-off process at the Labour Party is that nothing is policy unless both Keir's office and either me or Rachel has signed it off. And so that means that the Treasury team is not just involved when it's a question of pounds and pence, but it's also involved when it's in questions of regulatory design and policy design and making sure that we're really delivering against those other missions. So because we sit at the centre of all of that, even though we don't own the KPI on clearing the backlog in the NHS or kind of opening up opportunity through the education system, we are in conversation all of the time with all of our colleagues about everything. In fact, some of the reasons I was checking my phone, forgive me, was because of that issue, which I have to take a call about afterwards. On community pharmacies, to totally agree. If you look at my, it's a bit niche, social media next week, you'll see a video of me outside a community pharmacy in my constituency, encouraging people to get their winter shots and various other bits and bobs. We know they play a crucial part in the local system. And again, you'll hear from Wes's speech tomorrow and things he said before, that we have, one of the problems in the NHS, as you will know better than I, is that we kind of have this kind of accumulation and backlog in the hospital system, which is just enormously expensive. And so how we kind of do preventative health and preventative health spending and start to kind of move the dial a bit into preventative health and make sure that community care, not just in GP surgeries, but in community pharmacies as well, is going to be a really important part of that kind of system design. On tech, I mean, again, I could go on about this for a very long time, but I don't see how we answer the question on economic productivity or private sector reform, public sector reform, sorry, or pay without tech. I mean, it has to be at the heart of everything. So when you see our 5 missions, there is not a mission on tech for a reason, because it's not just something that someone does over there. It's a horizontal across all of our missions. It is about modernising the economy and modernising public services, and that is about technology done in the right way, which is a whole other panel, which maybe we can talk about next year. Thanks.
Fantastic. And just to add to that, on the community pharmacies at IPPR, we've been doing a body of work on health and prosperity, a commission on health and prosperity, as we think a neglected kind of part of the discussion is how we need public health within our communities, within our places, actually if we want a thriving economy. So I'd suggest looking up that work as well, if it's of interest. So I know that Darren has to go and take a call, and we're near the end of our time. But I do just want to come to each of our speakers for the most concise that you can manage, just one key takeaway from how Labour could unlock growth in UK industries. I'll go from that side to that. George.
It's come up throughout this panel. I think it's successfully getting that relationship, that partnership with business right. It doesn't mean that's not a one-way street. It doesn't mean handouts and nothing in return. It means telling businesses that they can have certainty, they can have strong industrial strategy and support for their investment, but we have to ensure that investment drives productive growth and equitable growth. And it's about being less dogmatic about the role of the state, but fundamentally, that catch-up, that gap on our productivity is the thing that we really need to close if we're actually going to capture growth in the 21st century. That was quick.
Competent government, political stability, and of course, a mission-oriented approach to the country where everybody is pointing in the same direction.
Fantastic. Chris?
Public-private partnership going forward on everything we do. I'm really interested in the National Wealth Fund. I'm particularly interested in the £1 of every public money and £3 of every private sector money. I mean, that'll be interesting to see how that pans out, because if you ask the private sector to take 75% of the investment risk, what's going to be their return? But I'll leave that for another day.
I suppose it being pro-business and working with business doesn't sit at odds with inclusive, sustainable growth. Don't be afraid to own that. And the second thing is just get a coherent economic plan and stick to it.
A resounding cry from most conference events I've been in, I think. So a huge thank you to all of you for coming, for your questions. A huge thank you to the City of London for partnering with us on this event. And thank you to all of our speakers. I hope you have a great final few hours of conference.